So one thing we can all agree on is that no matter what industry you're in, is that Australia is important. So thank you for the introduction and thanks for the opportunity to speak this afternoon. This does genuinely feel very important. I grew up in country towns until I headed for Sydney at 18 and went to university. And as Mick said, I've spent about half my professional life outside the country, 5 years in Asia, particularly with a lot of time in China and India, and then another 5 years based in Hong Kong and working around the world. And for all that time, I have been a fierce and very loyal Australian, a very patriotic Australian. And I chose to come back to Australia really for a simple reason, which was to connect with wider family and to bring my children back, my 3 children back, to enjoy the freedoms and the beauty and the opportunities that Australia can offer. And I say opportunities very deliberately, especially the opportunities, because I've always believed in the extraordinary potential of this country. And I count myself extremely lucky to be Australian. As Miriam Lyons wrote recently, our economy is heading for 22 years of consecutive growth, and unemployment is low. 3 in 4 Australian adults are on the global rich list. You heard me correctly, the global rich list, which means that we are counted amongst the world's top 10% of wealth owners. I'd hazard a guess and say that's everyone in this room. Australia's economic growth outstripped most other developed countries over the past 25 years, and we have the 3rd lowest public debt. The average net disposable household income in Australia is ranked 5th in the world, and we have the highest minimum wages in the world, and I say that very positively. So that's all great, and they're all a large part of the kind of reasons when I talk about opportunities in Australia. They're good reasons to come back, and they're good reasons to contribute. But all that said, Australia is a backwater. At least that's what my boss told me when I resigned in London and said I was returning. He's a dangerous sample of one, it's true, but he is the UK's highest paid CEO and one of the world's most influential business leaders. And elsewhere there are people in Asia who see us as lotus eaters, who see us as enjoying leisurely working hours and having a lazy mentality. Or they see us as a place with just bizarre animals and an anti-Asian racist undercurrent. Now, these characterisations may be harsh, may be unrepresentative, but they shouldn't be ignored. They're part of the context in which Australian agriculture is trying to do more business. We can be proud and patriotic, and we can listen to other perspectives at the same time. So I believe Australia is stuck. I believe the Australian story is stuck. I believe it's time for a healthy and spirited and holistic discussion, maybe even debate, around this theme. A discussion around Australia and the brand it has become and the brand it could become. So in the time that I've got, I want to give you a point of view about that. I want to give you a very simple model and way of looking at it, and then I want to give you a bit of a kind of a way of getting going. And I'm quite possibly cutting across what Bruce is going to talk about, and I think that's okay because, as I said, I think we should have a discussion and a debate. So Australia is like a willowy supermodel, born and blessed with an abundance of natural gifts, ogled, filmed, photographed wherever she goes, and wherever she goes she expects the world's attention, expects people to come to her to buy her drinks and to listen to her talk about herself. She suffers from the illusion that the world actually revolves around her. Self-absorbed, complacent, a poor listener, and prone to fickle relationships. Now, there's even a nod to this on the official Australia Unlimited website, with the suggestion that our beauty overshadows our brains. So if we want a role model for the supermodel analogy, let's look at Lily Cole, who, besides being an unusually beautiful woman, who has graced the pages of pretty much every Vogue on the planet and appeared in several feature films, has earned herself a double first from Cambridge between assignments. She's not just blessed, she's very bright. Or closer to home, Elle Macpherson, who's leveraged her natural assets and her business acumen into a global business empire. Now, in Australia, we say we live in God's country. And we say that with a certain assumption, perhaps presumption, echoed by Deloitte recently. If you go to the Deloitte website, you'll see that the world will knock on our door. As a result of the burgeoning middle class in Asia, the world will, quote unquote, the world will knock on our door. We assume that our good fortune should translate automatically into desire and demand for Australian produce. But we don't even tell the Australian story well at home, to Sue's point earlier. People don't know what farmers do. Most people don't know farmers. This room is a massive statistical aberration in the CBD. Just tell them it's Australian and they'll buy it. Is that pride talking or a pervasive complacency? So I believe there's a massive gap between the perception and the reality of Australian agribusiness. We think the perception is better than it is, but I also believe that the reality can and should be far stronger than most of us imagine. On TEN's The Project last week, I don't know whether any of you saw this, there was a story about having an Australian produce aisle in supermarkets. Anyone see that? The project ran a poll in which 90% of respondents said, hey, that's a really good idea. Why don't we have an Australian produce aisle in the supermarket? And they rang Coles, and Coles said, hey, we're open to new ideas. PR department handled it well. They rang Woolworths. Woolworths said, no, our customers like things the way they are. One of the hosts on the project said, look, you know, nice idea, but here's the truth of it. Everything in the Australian aisle will be a lot more expensive, and people will figure that out in a split second. And when it comes to cost, I'm sorry, but the hip pocket will win over patriotism every time. That's what he said. And to me, that's the issue right there. That the Australian produce story has been dumbed down to price. Grocery buyers think they're comparing apples with apples or fish with fish. And if the only difference between Australian produce and the competition is price, of course, people are going to buy on price. Same is true for export markets. So here's the challenge. We need to take Australian produce and add value with clever and consistent brand thinking, consistent market development strategies, and to bring to it a partnership mentality and a long-term determination to succeed. Well, can we do that? If we can do that, the future for Australian agribusiness is extremely bright for reasons which you guys know better than I do, but I'm staggered by the growth of the middle class in Asia, particularly China and India. By 2030, they'll be spending $32 trillion. That's 43% of global consumption. 2030 used to sound like a long time away when I was a kid, not so much now. But if we're not smart about it and we don't actually pull our socks up and get our act together, we're stuck in a race to the bottom of increasingly commoditised markets, both domestic and international, a race that everyone loses. So Australia has had a long history of being a low-cost producer of commodities, wool, beef, wheat and so on. We've been an unbranded exporter of bulk. We've traded and transacted with short-term objectives, and we have tried to impress with how big we are. Much of that history, I suggest to you, is inappropriate for the future. Big is a bad mentality. Australians love a good map. I've always loved a good map, because what a map does is it reassures us of our place in the world. Look at us. We're big. Big and bold and fooling ourselves that we are a major global player. All the beef in Australia is a snack to the Chinese market. Thinking we're a big player is bad for business. It stifles our entrepreneurialism, our creativity, our innovation, not to mention our humility. So it's useful to redraw the map by population. We are there. We are there. And it shows you a couple of things. It shows you the magnitude of the opportunity that we talk about, but it also shows our place in the scheme of things. We need to start behaving like a challenger, like a startup, like an upstart. We need to be more agile and entrepreneurial and engaged. We need to start thinking more about niches than global domination. Brand Australia needs to be reimagined in ways which leverage our very real and unique strengths, that address our weaknesses and connect Australia with the aspirations and desires of stakeholders, consumers and customers first of all. So I'm going to talk about brands and how to make them work for you and share some points that might help on that journey. The first is this: if brands drive value. It's brand that makes Apple, Nike and Google so formidable. It's brand that makes Denmark, New Zealand and Chile such fierce competitors in the agricultural space. For Australia, brand is a matter of national urgency and importance, not a goal to be achieved by 2025, according to the National Food Plan. It's a national brand failure that Danish butter is served on Qantas flights. It's a national brand failure that we're a net importer of fruit and vegetables. So let's talk about brands. They're often misunderstood. To many people, a brand is simply a moniker or a logo. It's something that you stamp ownership on, property, to send a signal, say, that's mine. And there's lots of them out there, and I'm not picking on anybody, I'm just going, here's some that we're familiar with. Australian made, Australia Unlimited, our own flag. To other people, brands are a slightly different thing. Brands are something that you do campaigns about in the media at great expense. Governments do this all the time. They promote the idea that campaigns fix things. And in both these views, brands are a kind of intellectual conceit that you move around with money. They're modelled on communications theory that says that build awareness, make people aware, and when they're aware, if you tell them enough, they'll be aware and their behaviour will change. But if only it were that easy. Tell them to stop smoking. Tell them to lose weight. Tell them to stop texting and driving at the same time. Tell them it's Australian and they'll buy it. Well, they won't. The Australian car, canned fruit and fashion industry is a testament to this. It's just not a very useful way to think about brands. And I met Sue briefly before. I can't see her now. Don't have my glasses on. But I could have kissed her. She said, and perhaps later. There's a much better way of thinking about brands, which I'll come to. But in my view, logos, taglines, campaigns are the very last thing that Australian agribusiness needs right now. They're expressions. They're not a plan. It's like building a house starting with the door handles and the tap fittings. Or maybe it's like a tip without an iceberg. So what we need is a new, simple way to think about Brand Australia. Sue, thank you. A brand is a relationship. Think about Australia or your sector or your company as a relationship. It's not something that you own or control. It lives in the space between you and your stakeholders. It's made of shared values, experiences, and stories. When you start to think this way, the first thing you learn is that brands are not really about you at all. They're about us. They're about a much wider notion. There's suddenly a need to listen to, respect, and collaborate with other shareholders. When A.G. Lafley took over the reins of Procter & Gamble in 2001 as global CEO, it's the world's largest packaged goods company. He dusted off their values. There were 10 commandments at P&G, and he dusted them off. They'd been there for years, and he had the entire organisation focus on just one. And that value was, the consumer is my boss. So suddenly everyone in that organisation, that massive company, was going around going, the consumer is my boss. I need to pay attention to the needs, the desires, the wants, the things that people out there, our consumers, our customers, people in the real world are saying. P&G is considered to be the university of marketing, the masters of marketing. But even they had been projecting themselves onto marketplaces, and they'd forgotten to engage with the people that matter most, their consumers. They'd forgotten about relationships. So on A.G. Lafley's watch, P&G doubled its performance on pretty much every measure you care to throw at me, but certainly including the share price. So we go back to the beginnings of this very simple model again. There's a logo, but it's the tip without an iceberg. And there's a whole bunch, and this applies to you, of assets and information out there that are currently not perhaps well understood or well arranged. But there's an opportunity to start banging them into some shape. Strong relationships are built on shared purpose, values, and experiences. And then the stories that exemplify and celebrate that purpose and those values. And so it is with strong brands. So what makes this such a challenge for Australian agribusiness? Well, two things. First is that Australia has a mixed reputation for relationships in the region. In consultations leading up to the Asian Century White Paper, Comments were made about Australia's apathy and lack of knowledge towards Asia, our role as a seller of things, as perhaps even wheeler dealers, a nation that's willing to have a price negotiation on everything. It doesn't speak well in terms of relationship building. Now, by contrast, the Canadian beef industry has been involved in a relationship with China for some considerable period of time. Their approach has been holistic and includes partnering on genetics, on live meat, and on production technologies. Not live meat, sorry, live cattle. And production technologies. And Fonterra, to use a closer to home example from New Zealand, has had a deep and abiding partnership with China for many years, which has served them well through thick and thin, and there has been thick and there has been thin. According to opinions canvassed through Advance, Australia's community of professional expats, there is a perception that Australians see things through Australian and English eyes, that we look to Washington for political approval, and even resent travelling on business to Asia. Now, these aren't helpful characterisations for relationship building in the region. That's the first reason. The second reason is this. The second reason that this matters so much in a relationship model because it's so much about purpose, meaning and values rather than image and communication. So let me explain that. No one wakes up saying, what a great day to hear from Australian agribusiness. It just doesn't happen. According to the World Tourism Organisation, in most parts of the world, there are 1.4 million country-based advertising messages going at people on a daily basis. Australia is just one of those voices. And as individuals, we deal with about 5,000 commercial messages a day. So people are overloaded and overwhelmed with information. We're up against increasingly distracted minds. These people don't want more communication. They want to feel connected. The antidote to distraction is more meaning, not more messaging. Or to put it another way, people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do what you do. So, why does Australian produce matter? A lot of brands fail because they only ever connect with people about, or attempt to connect with people about what they do, about the product. But brands succeed when they manage to connect with people about how, and most importantly, why they do what they do. So, Apple's why is about amplifying human abilities. It's been that way since Jobs started the company way back when. Amplify human abilities. Google has been about democratising the world's information. Whole Foods in the US is about making the world a better place with good food. And here's an example. It's the only bit of video I'm going to show you, but an example from an American fast food company called Chipotle. And for those people who are in the pork business, you may know about this already, or if you don't, you should. I think it's a really great example of a very clearly purposeful, values-based brand.
Just guessing at numbers and figures, pulling the puzzles apart. Questions of science and progress don't speak as loud as my heart. Nobody said it was easy. It's such a shame for us to part. Nobody said it was easy. No one ever said it would be so hard. I'm going back to the start.
Willie Nelson singing Coldplay. It's quite cool. It's a good start. Cultivate a better world. So when I'm talking about a purpose or a why, that's Chipotle's why. Chipotle is kicking ass, if you'll pardon the language, in America in the fast food space. Their stock is red hot. They're a publicly traded company. For a time, McDonald's were a shareholder, so when the founders started the business, McDonald's got in early and helped them expand the business. Really didn't work out. It wasn't a marriage that was made in heaven, and so the founder bought the business back and has since gone public. And it's a really good example of a purpose that's about quality of life, quality of food, and authenticity. The earlier panel was talking about transparency being well, perhaps a threat and perceived as a threat. Transparency is perceived by Chipotle, at least, to be a virtue. And so they would welcome anyone to poke a camera around their supply chain, and they do. They use it actively as part of their marketing. They talk about having happy pigs. So it's a way to look at, back to this triangle, if we started off with a tip without an iceberg and we have a whole bunch of assets and information around Australian agribusiness that we start to corral and put into a framework, the bit in the middle and the real engine of all this is about why. It's about finding meaning and stories that connects with consumers and customers and other stakeholders, but I'd suggest to you consumers and customers first. We need a big, beautiful why for Australian agribusiness and a big, beautiful why for every sector. Denmark has one. It's around innovation and quality. I don't speak Danish, so I can't do it justice. New Zealand has one that's anchored in purity and quality. And these have both been long-term strategic plays. 100% pure New Zealand is now 14 years old. It was born out of the insight that New Zealand is the world's youngest country, geologically speaking. So why buy Australian? It's an important question. It's minimum an $11 billion question, because that's how much money we spend every year importing food into Australia, not to mention the export earning potential that's unlocked when we get the answer right. In other words, it's crucial. A loud and clear Australian brand will also create some leverage with our friends at Woolworths and Coles, who have a public proposition around supporting Australian farmers. And there seems to be a shift, certainly recently, in their position on this, where they seem to be having more, including more Australian produce in their high-end house brands. A more powerful Australian brand might also get Australian agribusinesses better aligned. So German and French businesses are purported to approach market development with a strong, unified nation brand story, and so does New Zealand. Australian businesses, by contrast, are rumoured to tell stories about how bad their Australian counterparts or competitors are, making us all look stupid. So, back to why buy Australian. We're not going to answer this question in precise terms in this room, but I can tell you precisely where the answer will be found, in a very simple model. Simple model that brings together three things. The truth about Australian, about discovering the things that make Australian produce and Australian agriculture, Australian farming unique and different. That's the top circle. The next one is about human truths. And those things will be things like high quality, but don't take it for granted. We like to think that beef, for example, is the highest quality, but according to some research done by the Canadians, they didn't finish first, by the way, they finished second behind the US, and Australia was third. So we shouldn't take high quality as a given, but definitely it's a huge advantage for Australia. Safety is a massive and growing issue, particularly in Asian markets, so food safety is super important, and Australia has got a very good story around monitoring, certification, regulation and so on. Traceability, a tremendous virtue. I know the room flinched when the lady earlier suggested that you might have live cameras in abattoirs. I don't see that as a preposterous idea at all. I think transparency, however uncomfortable it may make you, is here and here to stay. Biodiversity, fair treatment of workers. Apple's got itself into the most trouble in the last few years around worker treatment in assembly plants in China. It's an issue for consumers. Employment is a good story around agriculture in Australia, animal welfare, a good story, technology, innovation and sustainable practices. So Australia has got a lot of stuff in that top circle, which is great. In terms of human truths, I don't want to try and hazard a guess at all of them, but certainly safety, certainty, premiumness, provenance, a sense of where things come from, very important, and a sense of character. And then the last part is this, and this didn't used to be necessary in thinking about a brand and taking a brand to market, but cultural truths are absolute imperatives now. What's going on in the world that relates to what we're attempting to do? What is some momentum that we can build on and work with? Connections to the natural world, authenticity, transparency, animal welfare, and the list goes on. So this is how I propose, and the sweet spot is in the centre. So that's the answer. That's where the purpose, that's where the meaning, that's where it's going to come from, where those three things come together. So how to go about it? This is what I would suggest. You put a small working group together. You were talking yesterday earlier about a coalition of the willing. Small working group representing, I'd suggest, fruit and vegetable growers, meat and seafood, perishables. And one or two advisory bodies. It should be an entrepreneurial group. Farmers are entrepreneurs. You are risk takers. Because this is an exercise in business building, not an exercise in bureaucracy or politics. It should be lean and it should be fast. Women should be extremely well represented in that working group. As women here, as women everywhere, control about 72% of household spending and much more when it comes to food. And Asian markets should be directly engaged in this working group. There should be and the results of it should be a brand and engagement strategy that is simple and clear and that everyone can embrace. It should be funded by the DAF levy, or maybe if not, by a do-it-yourself levy. Just do it. Full accountability and tight deadlines. That's part one. Part two is develop an agile innovation model. There's a lot of research, there's always room for more, but my understanding is that the industry has been swamped by research over the last few years. I think you need to get into prototype and testing, learning in the real world, running real experiments, like real farmers meeting real people and telling that story. There's a lot to be said by running a design innovation model. Empathy, understand the issues, define the problem when you've done that first part, come up with some ideas, figure out the best ones, best guess, get it 70% right, that's okay, prototype it at high speed and low cost, take it to market, see what happens, and then do it all again, and again, and again. Fast, cheap, you learn a whole lot faster than doing things by conventional methodology. And the third thing is about resilience. So success is not based on luck. The harder you work, the luckier you're going to get. This isn't a short-term silver bullet fix. This is the start of a long-term commitment about building a relevant and powerful brand for Australia. I used to do a lot of work with Shell and spent time in The Hague, which is their headquarters, and they had the same issue. Their question was, when I go to sit down with the president of Kazakhstan, I don't have a story. And out in the lobby are the guys from Exxon and BP, and they've got a story. What's our story? What's our brand? Well, I can tell you this much, that in 2007, Shell added a fourth pillar to their strategic plan. They had always had upstream exploration, they had always had refining, and they had always had downstream or retail. And in 2007 they added a fourth, which was brand. That's how important they considered that to be. And if you're interested afterwards, I can tell you what the answer was. So it's about resilience and long-term commitment. Remember, the Kiwis have been at this for 14 years already. They've got a 14-year head start. So, the future of Australian agribusiness, I think it's bright if we put our brightest thinking to it. Let's not fall for the supermodel syndrome and think the world owes us somehow a living, because it doesn't. We need to make it happen. We need the power of a great Australian brand to help us. That brand will be a brilliant answer to the question, why buy Australian? It'll be a storytelling platform for all Australian agribusiness. And we need action more than we need words. So because so much of this is about Asia, I'm just going to finish with a very simple quote from Madam Chiang Kai-shek, who said, on the subject of action, we write our own destiny, we become what we do. Thank you.